I welcome this opportunity to explain the global significance of what is happening in Angola, the events that brought us to this point, the United States objective, and the major consequences which can result. The Soviet Union's massive and unprecedented intervention in the internal affairs of Africa, with nearly $200 million of arms and its military technicians and advisors, with 11,000 Cuban combat troops, and with substantial sea and airlift and naval cover in adjacent waters, is a matter of urgent concern. Not only are the interests of the countries directly affected at stake, but also the interests of all nations in preserving global stability, which is precondition for all else mankind aspires to accomplish.
Victor Sims, the Z historian. In the late 20th century, international relations were dominated by the end of the Second World War, decolonization, and an ideological and geopolitical standoff between two great powers, the United States and the Soviet Union. To many observers at the time, Africa was seen as comic relief, a convenient sideshow, a good joke, or even a bad one. Anything to break the tension elsewhere. And where better to find humor than in Africa? But in 1975, something happened in southern Africa that shattered this illusion. Cuba, the United States, and the Soviet Union were drawn directly into the region alongside the white settler regimes of apartheid South Africa and Rhodesia. Furthermore, at the center were frontline states led by Zambia and Tanzania. And suddenly, Africa was no longer a punchline. It had become a strategic pressure point, and the danger facing the region and the world beyond it was anything but funny. Vienna, May 1977. Walter Mandel, the crusading American liberal, sits across a blue-top table from John Vorster, a tough Afrikaner who had been a member of a pro-Nazi organization during World War II and who had led South Africa since 1966.
Because it is only if you take a pride in that which belongs to you that you can take a pride in South Africa, the common fatherland.
Vorster and Mandel word wrestled for 8 hours over 2 days and afterward described the talks as cordial. However, transcripts revealed a different story. Mandel struck a combative, bossy tone from the first encounter on May 19th and maintained it through the final hour on May 20th. He also set the agenda, first Rhodesia, then Namibia, and then South Africa itself. He was in Vienna not to negotiate, but to convey the administration's hardline message to the South African leader in unambiguous and authoritative terms. Vorster was stunned. The encounter was nothing like his customary conspiratorial interactions with US Secretary of State Henry Kissinger and more recently with British Foreign Secretary David Owen. The meeting with Mandel was not business as usual. And when Vorster requested a private, off-the-record meeting, as was done previously, Mandel's response was adamant. There would be only one meeting. They were not going to talk one way in public and another way in private. As such, even lunch was taken separately. In the first session, Mandel sought Vorster's commitment to press Ian Smith to get negotiations for Rhodesia back on track. On Namibia, Vorster insisted that Namibia was not a country, but rather a collection of tribal areas that should each elect representatives within a loosely federal system. Mandel rejected this as a thinly veiled way for Pretoria to maintain control over the country. But Vorster was unyielding. On the last day, Mandel addressed what he called the most difficult and emotional issue. He told Vorster that the United States did not believe apartheid or separateness was workable or just. His remarks, which the South African characterized as a lengthy homily, were threaded with references to the American civil rights experience. He added that President Carter wanted this message conveyed. If South Africa did not begin ending apartheid, US policy would diverge from Pretoria's, and the choice lay with Vorster's government.
In some circles, it is suggested that I'm going to Vienna to take orders. I'm not going there to take orders, I'm going there to discuss, and I presume, and I accept that that is also Mr. Mandel's intention, to have a full and frank discussion with me with regard to these various matters.
Vorster was undeterred. He refused to equate Africans in South Africa with African Americans in the US, adding that Africans in South Africa did not consider themselves members of his nation. He argued that South Africa was multinational, not multiracial, and that introducing a one-man, one-vote system would mean scrapping the government.
Will there ever be one man, one vote in South Africa?
No.
Isn't that why you are almost certain to be faced with a bloody war?
No, but there's not one man, one vote anywhere in
Because
Africa.
20 million black people in
No,
your
but you
country
see, your
wish
problem
to have
is
the vote.
it is no use. You keep on arguing about 20 million blacks. And I say to you that if that is your argument, you do not understand the situation.
That is not how the blacks see it, Minister.
And apparently you refuse to see that way. Now, I tell you, I'm giving you the facts.
The resistance didn't surprise Mandela. In fact, he was expecting it. But the message was loud and clear. During his press conference following the meeting, Mandela's comments to the press made headlines, especially his definition of full participation. You see, full participation was the phrase the State Department had recommended he use, but one man, one vote signaled the Carter administration's demand that all races have equal votes and thus equal rights in a unitary state. Those in the room understood the significance immediately. A painful, almost embarrassed silence followed, as the New York Times later observed, and the press conference ended. The State Department, without elaboration, reported that the Vice President had clearly and incisively placed US policy towards South Africa on the public record. The Carter administration had seized the moral high ground, and Pretoria was furious, labeling Mandela's words a knife in the back and vowing retaliation. That response, however, would have to wait. South Africa was already entangled in another complex problem it had ironically entered alongside an American Secretary of State.
We are not fighting against Angola. We are not fighting against the Angolan people, the security forces of Angola. Our target, our enemy is SWAPO.
When Portugal's empire unraveled after the 1974 Carnation Revolution, Angola's anti-colonial struggle snapped into a three-way contest. MPLA, Luanda-based with Marxist leaning, FNLA, North, linked to Zaire, and UNITA, Southeast, led by Jonas Savimbi. In 1975, as independence neared, outside powers rushed to fill the vacuum. South Africa pushed north under Operation Savannah to prevent an MPLA victory and to contain SWAPO and the broader anti-apartheid tide. Now, this is where it is important to introduce the man, Henry Alfred Kissinger, and the mess he would create for the US in Africa.
Kissinger, he stretched my patience.
He was a demanding perfectionist with his staff. Nothing could ever be right.
He stretched my nerves.
There was also a joke that if Henry didn't yell at you, he didn't love you.
I would quit about once a week. He was a friend, a mentor, and a tormentor.
Henry Kissinger came to Africa with a great power lens forged in Nazi-era Germany as a youth, Harvard, and détente. His strategy was simple: focus on Moscow and Beijing, treat marginal regions as instruments, and put order before justice. He was often described as a bloodhound that followed only one scent: Soviets. He believed, like many others, that African affairs made only for good humor, and he was apparently a very funny man. Until 1975. When chaos ensued in Angola, seeing a cheap but sweet win against the Soviets, Kissinger backed FNLA and later UNITA through the CIA, a move that dovetailed with South Africa's invasion in October 1975. Kissinger's Africa gambit backfired. What he hoped would be a tidy US win became an international embarrassment, leaving Washington looking complicit with apartheid. The 1976 presidential campaign unfolded against that backdrop with a fierce debate over Angola, the morality of covert operations, Congress's proper role, and how to respond to the Soviet challenge. In early January, Senate hearings opened. Kissinger, the first witness, did not tell the whole truth, saying South Africa had sent some military personnel into Angola when some meant roughly 3,000 troops and without US consultation. So what exactly went wrong with the South African operation in Angola? Pretoria went in thinking it was a quick, deniable police action. The plan was a rapid armored thrust along the roads from Namibia, linking up with the FNLA and UNITA, seizing key towns and crossings, and being on Luanda's doorstep before anyone could react. Intelligence said the MPLA was fragmented outside the capital. SWAPO could be pushed back easily, and as a bonus, Zaire and covert US help would keep the Northern Front moving. Simple, right? Wrong.
Ha continuado el cerco. Por el norte avanzan fuerzas de Zaire, mercenarios europeos y traidores del FNLA, pertrechados con armas norteamericanas.
Unexpectedly, or perhaps not, Cuba responded with Operation Carlota, deploying thousands of Cuban troops and equipment by air and sea to secure Luanda and blunt the South African advance, turning a low-risk covert operation into a proxy confrontation. Congress recoiled, passing the Tunney and Clark amendments to shut down US aid to Angola, and South Africa began to withdraw.
Y esa es la razón por la cual los imperialistas están irritados, entre otros con nosotros. Algunos imperialistas se preguntan ¿por qué ayudamos a los angoleños? ¿Qué intereses tenemos nosotros allí? Ellos están acostumbrados a pensar que cuando un país hace algo es porque está buscando petróleo, o cobre, o diamante, o algún recurso natural. No, nosotros no buscamos ningún interés material y los imperialistas es lógico que no lo entiendan. Porque seguían por criterios exclusivamente chauvinistas, nacionalistas, egoístas. Estamos cumpliendo un elemental deber internacionalista cuando ayudamos al pueblo de Angola.
Cuba's move was meant to prove that a small revolutionary state could defend anti-colonial allies on principle, not merely as an instrument of the Soviet Union. Havana's calculus blended revolutionary internationalism, anti-apartheid solidarity, and a bid for strategic credibility and deterrence, raising the price of any Western-backed takeover. That decision set the board for a sharper duel between Cuba and the United States across Angola, and leads us to the architect of Havana's wager, Fidel Castro. Fidel Castro emerged from Cuba's post-war political frustration as a young nationalist lawyer opposing Fulgencio Batista's 1952 coup. He burst onto the national stage with the failed attack on the Moncada barracks on July 26, 1953. Tried and jailed, he delivered his 2-hour defense, "History will absolve me," then left for exile after a 1955 amnesty. In Mexico, he forged the 26th of July movement, trained guerrillas alongside Che Guevara, and sailed back to Cuba aboard the Granma in November 1956. Ambushed on landing, a small cadre fought into the Sierra Maestra, built rural support, and waged a disciplined insurgency while urban networks sabotaged the regime. By late 1958, the momentum was irreversible. Batista fled on January 1st, 1959, and Castro entered Havana days later, the face of a revolution that would soon reshape Cuba and slot it squarely into the Cold War. While Fidel Castro trained in Mexico and sailed back on the Granma, Southern Africa tightened like a coil. Zambia, then Northern Rhodesia, sat inside the white-dominated Federation of Rhodesia and Nyasa land, 1953 to 63, sold as partnership but enforced through centralized power and racial hierarchy. By the late 1950s, that bargain was fraying. In townships and mining compounds, quiet networks formed. In beer halls and union offices, petitions gave way to protest. The Federation was a political dead end. Enter Kenneth David Kaunda, young, relentless, unwilling to bargain away a nation's dignity. In 1958, he broke from Haring Kumbula's ANC to found the Zambian African National Congress, demanding an end to the Federation and immediate majority rule. Where Castro's weapon was the rifle, Kaunda's was organization, rallies and unions, sermons and song, and a disciplined ethic of non-violent resistance. When John F. Kennedy took office, he inherited a lit fuse. The CIA had already built Brigade 2506, training it in Guatemala and Nicaragua, and drawn up a bold Trinidad landing near anti-Castro networks. Kennedy, wary of an obvious US fingerprint so early in his presidency, insisted on more deniability and shifted the target to Bahia de Cochinos, the Bay of Pigs on the edge of the Zapata swamp. Isolated, easier to deny, but also harder to escape. Moreover, Cuban intelligence had penetrated exile circles, so Havana mobilized fast in response to the invasion launched between 17th and 19th April 1961. Within just 72 hours, the invasion was crushed. Immediately, Cuba took the matter to the United Nations, where US Ambassador Adlai Stevenson II, unaware of the operation, struggled to defend Washington's position.
These charges are totally false, and I deny them categorically.
After the incident, Castro emerged stronger at home and defiant abroad. Reading the fiasco as a prelude to a second, larger assault, he moved to harden the revolution and tighten ties with Moscow. For First Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, Nikita Khrushchev, who had taken a personal liking to Castro, protecting Cuba while redressing the strategic imbalance of US missiles in Turkey and Italy, made tempting sense. And by mid-1962, the bet turned bolder. Soviet nuclear missiles on Cuban soil to deter any future US invasion. Cuba's shield, the Soviets' insurance and catalyst for the most dangerous standoff of the age.
Regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union.
Before flying to Zambia, US Secretary of State Henry Kissinger stopped in Tanzania. President Julius Nyerere, widely seen as the unofficial leader of the Frontline states, mattered to him more than his misgivings about Nyerere's politics. If Washington hoped to keep Cuban forces out of the Rhodesian conflict, Kissinger knew he would need the cooperation of the Frontline leadership, above all Nyerere and Zambia's Kenneth Kaunda.
The United States declares its support in the strongest terms for the proposals made by British Prime Minister Callaghan on March 22nd of this year. That independence must be preceded by majority rule.
In 1972, Kaunda recast Zambia as a one-party participatory democracy. UNIP's justification was that multi-party competition was fueling tribal and regional divisions and that a national party was necessary to protect unity and stability as well as focus on development and the liberation struggle.
By the conscious decision of the people of this nation, Zambia will soon be a one-party participatory democracy. This is why the deliberations of this National Council are so important.
Of all the frontline leaders, Kenneth Kaunda carried the heaviest load. Since independence, he had championed a shared purpose: one Zambia, one nation, in an attempt to forge a national identity. Yet a 1976 NSC interdepartmental review judged that the one-party framework he inaugurated in 1971 had neither unified the country nor improved administration, noting that deep ethnic divisions persisted. Moreover, the same assessment stressed that Kaunda's horizon was never merely domestic. Securing majority rule in Rhodesia and independence for Namibia were described as vital Zambian interests.
In the event of South Africans, intervening in the Rhodesian situation, then of course the whole thing will change, and the people in Zimbabwe, Rhodesia, Zimbabwe to be tomorrow, will have all the right to invite any outside power to come and help them.
As Anthony Lake, then the State Department's policy planning director, later told Congress, no nation has had a greater interest in achieving majority rule in Rhodesia than Zambia, and no nation has made greater sacrifices toward that end. Yet Zambia was built on copper, and as the world's fourth largest producer, it was hit hard when prices plunged in May 1974. Worse, landlocked and dependent on neighbors' rail and road networks, it lived at others' mercy. In 1973, after Kenneth Kaunda sheltered guerrillas fighting in Rhodesia, Ian Smith shut the border. Even when he later offered to reopen it with conditions, Kaunda refused on principle. The cost was immediate. Lusaka had to stitch together longer inferior routes to move goods out and to bring in essential commodities such as fuel and fertilizer. The Chinese-backed Tazara Railway, meant to open a lifeline from Zambia's mines to Tanzania's ports, opened in 1976 but underperformed, hauling barely a fifth of its projected cargo. With copper prices collapsing and the Rhodesian War intensifying, Zambia's trade was choked by geography and failing corridors. Amid this squeeze, Kenneth Kaunda practiced hard-edged non-alignment. To Western eyes, non-alignment looked like an aspiration. To Lusaka, it was a survival strategy. And because Zambia sat between the hotspots of Angola, Mozambique, and Rhodesia, Kenneth Kaunda became crucial to US policy. Hastily invited in April 1975, 10 days before the fall of Saigon, his visit was, as the New York Times put it, as important as it is overdue. At the White House dinner, Kaunda broke decorum with a stark rebuke. US policy toward Africa, or the lack of it, had given comfort to the forces of evil. He charged that Southern Africa was edging toward dangerous war, and the patience of the oppressed was slowly reaching its limits. The US ambassador later recalled that the toast made Henry Kissinger furious. In 1975, Kenneth Kaunda publicly rebuked Washington. A year later, Kissinger arrived in Zambia. The New York Times warned, "The hour is late," and Kaunda had already declared talks over on Rhodesia and called for armed struggle. Suspicious, he granted Kissinger only a modest platform where the secretary pledged a new US approach grounded in racial justice, strong backing for the British path to majority rule within 2 years, repeal of the Byrd Amendment, aid for the frontline states, and pressure on South Africa. Kaunda was moved. He embraced Kissinger and reconsidered his position. However, the applause in Lusaka soon collided with Washington's debate over a single, unforgiving detail: money. In 1977, the International Security Assistance Act lit a fire in Congress. It funded everything from jets for Israel to food for Bangladesh. Furthermore, within the $222.8 million set aside for sub-Saharan Africa, nearly $100 million was earmarked for a Zimbabwe Development Fund for a state that didn't yet exist. Apparently, the Zimbabwe Development Fund was proposed in 1976 by Henry Kissinger after his first meeting with John Vorster and was designed to make a negotiated transition to African majority rule in Rhodesia palatable to white Rhodesians and acceptable to apartheid South Africa. Folded into a US-UK shuttle package, it promised reconstruction money and, crucially, compensation so white property owners wouldn't face total losses if they stayed or left under majority rule. But critics said the purpose shifted. Representative Don Bonker called it a thinly disguised bribe, a framing that sat poorly with the Carter team. Representative Stephen Solers pressed harder. Why wasn't the fund training Africans? And why no aid for Zambia, Tanzania, or Mozambique? He singled out Kenneth Kaunda as a continent statesman with a pivotal role in any transition to majority rule. To be sure, on Capitol Hill, Africa consumed an outsized share of debate time on the aid bill. In dollars, it was trivial, but in ideology, it was central. A primary arena for the late 1970s foreign policy fights over human rights and the Soviet threat. It was ideal terrain for these arguments, more distant than Latin America, less volatile than the Middle East, more fluid than Europe, and less haunted by recent failure than Asia. And the burden of turning rhetoric into policy fell to two of America's highest officials.
Andrew, it is time.
It had been in Lisbon in April 1974 that left-leaning military officers had staged the coup that had turned Southern Africa, 3,500 miles away, upside down. And it was in Lisbon, 3 years later, on May 15, 1977, that two of America's highest officials, Walter Mondale and Ambassador Andrew Jackson Young, were discussing how to cope with the continuing aftershocks of the independence of the Portuguese colonies. The two men genuinely liked and respected each other, one a liberal champion of the civil rights movement, and the other one of its chief activists. Both men faced tough assignments in the days ahead. Mondale was bound for Vienna to meet South Africa's Prime Minister John Vorster, while Young was heading to Maputo to address a UN conference on Rhodesia and Namibia. They were carrying out decisions from the March 3rd NSC meeting, which had directed them to be forthright with Pretoria on apartheid while pressing hard for movement on Rhodesia and Namibia. In Vienna, Mondale took the Carter administration's message about apartheid straight to the source. In firm but non-confrontational terms, he planned to, as he said, put the burner on Vorster. US relations with South Africa, he stated, had reached a watershed. Young, meanwhile, would be in Maputo to deliver a speech explaining the administration's new policy to the leaders of African countries and independence movements, most of whom were intensely skeptical of just how new Jimmy Carter's Washington was.
I think that in a real sense, Africa's interests and US interests are not in conflict in Southern Africa. That we will all profit by majority rule and by as peaceful a transition as possible. The sooner the struggle for liberation moves into a struggle for development, the better off will all of the peoples of Africa be.
Launched by a United Nations General Assembly vote in December 1976 to back the peoples of Zimbabwe and Namibia, the Maputo Conference was initially scorned by Western Security Council partners. Canada, France, the United Kingdom, and West Germany, who predicted a third world tirade against Western imperialism and refused attendance or funding. Paris even urged the European community to stay away, and UK Minister Ted Rowlands wrote,
"We should not attend."
Then word arrived in mid-April that Andrew Young intended to go. Young had once again turned a tidy boycott into a diplomatic problem. Officials noted that the United States had never sent a delegate to a UN decolonization conference, and David Owen urged Washington that attending Maputo was not a sound idea. He argued the draft resolution circulating was too extreme. Signing it would complicate bridge building with Ian Smith and John Vorster, while refusing to sign after showing up would squander any goodwill. Angola's president's greeting to the assembled delegates at Maputo was not encouraging. He framed Maputo as a trench in the battle between freedom and colonial oppression. Furthermore, tensions spiked on May 14th when the Rhodesian army threatened Zambia and launched its heaviest raid yet into Botswana, claiming to hit patriotic front camps. The next day, President Kaunda sent a detailed letter to Jimmy Carter deploring the threats to Zambia and blaming both Smith and John Vorster. In his letter, Kenneth Kaunda told Jimmy Carter that South Africa was involved in military plans against Zambia and warned that any attack would mean war and Zambia would call on anyone necessary to defeat the enemy.
Enemy has been prepared for the last 60, 70 years, South Africa, for the last 54 years, Rhodesia. What's more, centuries behind them coming from the Western countries, vested interests. That is the correct analysis of the problem. And unless you understand it in this way, you will be misled by the enemy. The enemy is bent on destroying your Morero, Zambians. We in Zambia are peaceful people, peace-loving. I challenge anyone to say today here that Zambia is a warmongering nation. I met John Foster, the arch-fascist and racist, on the bridge. On the bridge. In search of peace. I failed. I failed. Joshua Nkomo came here and said he was going to make another try. I said, Joshua, don't. This thing is dead. He said, I must try. I said, you are a free man. He went to Salisbury. For weeks he was there. He failed. He was in search of peace. Ian Smith has come here. And I knew I would be subject to misunderstanding by my colleagues in frontline countries, by my colleagues on the continent, by my colleagues and others in the whole world. I have allowed Smith to come here on a number of occasions in search of peace. But I'm a man with a conscience, clear conscience. God is hearing me. I can never sell out Africa. Never. Not me. Not these boys here. Not these girls here. We are men and women of principle. We have done all these things in search of peace. But it has to be genuine peace, based on sincere, genuine majority rule. Anything else, you can kill us. Zambians will be born out of our blood will continue to fight. We are such a people.